If you've ever studied network engineering, you know about the famous 7-layer model. What if I told you that's not how the internet actually works? It's an artifact of a standards war which was covered up because the best networking minds of the time lost to a bunch of anarchists and hippies. Ever since the first two computers were built, people have been working on trying to get them to communicate. But in order to do so, there needs to be some defined protocol or standard for them to communicate with. In the 1970s and 80s, the big telephone companies were working on a set of standards called OSI. It's called Open Standards Interconnect, but that's not very important. And meanwhile, the US Department of Defense was working on another system called Internet Protocol. The DoD meant to use Internet Protocol internally, but they also allowed universities to interconnect for research purposes. Now, it's important to understand that at the time, Internet meant internetworking, as in networking across organizational boundaries. This internet was specifically defined as experimental only, and commercial usage was strictly prohibited. But some people in the internetworking community had a different idea. They imagined a worldwide network without any rules and controls where anything would be possible, and internet as a proper noun became their code word. This idea spread, people got it, and by 1995 it was all but impossible to keep businesses off the internet. So the government handed it over to the private sector, and by this time the OSI dream was all but dead. This was bad news for the telephone companies, because they had their best engineers working on OSI for over 10 years, and they'd been telling their customers that the internet was little more than a toy for hippies and free thinkers. So to limit the humiliation, they pretended that the internet was just an implementation of OSI and that they had planned this all along. And to this day, when you learn about networking, you learn the OSI 7-layer model, which doesn't really fit reality, but that's how they teach it anyway. So how could it be that the best minds of network engineering at the time were bested by a bunch of university researchers and open communication activists? The story comes down to simple designs and effective execution. The telephone companies at the time were trying to solve a really hard problem. How could you get telephone calls and data around the world at the same time without calls echoing or dropping? This might seem trivial now as we have voice and mobile data on our phones at the same time, but at the time this was a major challenge. There's only so much bandwidth in a network, and when somebody's using that bandwidth to make a call, it can't be used to download data. Think about cars on the road, and when there's too many cars going to the same place, you get a traffic jam. So the telephone companies designed an intricate system where devices would first request an authorization to send data and then send it only when they knew the way was clear. The internet people had an entirely different approach. They weren't thinking about handling telephone calls, they were thinking about data only, and this gave them significant leeway over the design constraints of the telephone people. If it took a little longer for the data to get there, it would just make a web page load slower. It wasn't going to cause a phone call to echo or drop. But what about the traffic jam? What they did to solve that was pure anarchistic genius. They threw decades of networking best practices right out the window and made it a rule that network routers could just silently drop data. It was as if traffic jams were to be solved by randomly blowing a few cars off the road. As unorthodox as this may seem, and as unorthodox as it was, this trick really worked. To prevent data from being lost, the devices would simply resend the data if it wasn't acknowledged in due time. This was one of the major lessons of networking: move the intelligence to the edge. It was also a way for the telephone companies to make a compelling argument that this network would never be anything more than a toy. After all, what kind of network makes unreliability an explicit design choice? But by moving the problem to the edge, the network core became that much more simple and easier to implement. And these days, routers almost never drop data. This feature, which was the cause of so much condemnation in its day, is now little more than a safety valve and not something used in common usage. And even the question of delay has proven relatively moot, with the internet managing video and audio calls almost as well as the telephone system, and at least well enough that nobody really cares. But it was not just clever design and strategic simplification which made the internet more successful. It was a culture where progress was held sacred. In 1992, David Clark said, "We reject kings, presidents, and voting. We believe in rough consensus and running code." The rejection of kings is hardly controversial in the 20th century, and perhaps even the rejection of presidents or any form of central authority. But the outright rejection of voting, that takes things a whole step further. So what is this rough consensus in running code, and why is it better than a vote? You may have at some point had the experience where you have an idea, you know exactly what you want to do, and you're ready to do it, but you need some committee's permission to go forward. And as soon as you present your idea, you have a dozen people jumping in, rewriting it, arguing with you and each other, trying to change your proposal to make it more work, which solves other problems, and which no longer effectively solves the problem you set out to solve in the beginning. These people aren't really committed to carrying your project forward, they're just sharing ideas. But because of them, it's harder to get anything done at all. To say the telecommunications companies designed specifications this way would be an understatement. Telephone standards were not so much discussed as they were negotiated. In one relatively famous case, a protocol called ATM ended up being an awkward 53-byte cell size because the Americans and the French couldn't agree on the number, so they split it down the middle. In the era of big telephones, stories like these were commonplace, with every special interest getting their own little carve-out in this protocol design. Needless to say, every standard was proprietary and copies were sold at high cost to try to pay the busybodies who wrote it. The early internet pioneers took an entirely different route, standardizing the way computers would communicate through a body known as the Internet Engineering Task Force. Already the name task force sounds like something which is meant to work efficiently, but they took it a step further, with each specification written in a simple little text document known as an RFC, or Request for Comments. Right there, the objective was laid out. An RFC was a request for comments, not for approval, authorization, negotiations, or vote, just for comments. And unlike the telephone companies, the IETF required that RFCs be liberally licensed so that anyone could read and reproduce them. Since 1995, when the internet went commercial and rapidly became serious business, the IETF has lost some of its famous agility. But the principle of sanctifying progress and experimentation has carried through in free software and the rapidly evolving protocols that run over the internet. So what have we learned from this? We learned that David and Goliath stories really do happen sometimes, and getting bureaucracy out of people's way can make a world of difference. And we've learned that sometimes the best way to solve a challenging research project is to figure out how not to solve it. For years, networking researchers had been trying to perfect reliable networking, but it was unreliable networking which ultimately won the day. Leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video, comment down below on how you think protocols should be designed, and as always, stay awesome.